You're right, guys, and welcome to the latest episode of Muscle Owl Talks. I'm here today with two of Action Duchenne's finest, Diana Ribeiro, who's been on the show before with our good friend Ravi Mehta, and Lynnette Ellison. Lynnette, do you want to introduce yourself, Lynnette?
Sure, thanks. So I'm Lynnette Ellison. I live in St Neots with my three children and my lovely husband. My middle son, Samson, was diagnosed with muscular dystrophy with Duchenne a year and a half ago, so in the back end of 2015. It took 6 months to kind of get our feet back on the ground, and I then took a position at Action Duchenne, left my job in the city to come and work for the charity and dedicate my working life to trying to make life better for people living with Duchenne.
Wow, that's so soon. I didn't realise it was so soon. That's wonderful. Gosh. And Diana, do you want to introduce? I mean, you've been on before.
I have. Oh, well, thank you, Peter, for having us on, and Lynnette, that's really difficult to follow. So my name is Diana. I'm the CEO of Action Duchenne, and I've been at Action Duchenne for 6 years, having done all aspects of the charity work, so fundraising, campaigning, lobbying, and really delighted to work with such an amazing and inspirational community, but also lovely to see the young people and adults coming into their own and contributing to the field. So we're delighted to be here today.
Wonderful. So I thought today it would be good to talk about clinical trials, and I think we have a few questions on clinical trials. And I think clinical trials, they can seem so important for so many families with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They provide hope for families with Duchenne muscular dystrophy and young men with Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well, the whole community. But there's quite a complex nature to them as well, isn't there? So maybe if we put our questions to Diana, I don't know, Lynnette, do you want to start off?
Yeah, sure. So clinical trials, from our perspective as kind of really fairly newly diagnosed family, you've never heard of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. You've never really understood clinical trials as a family. So to be presented by this science stuff as a normal family, it is mind blowing, and it takes months, probably years, to even get to grips with it. We know some families who spend hours at a time researching and finding out bits and pieces. So there's some basic questions which are really common in the community, and one of them is, so for example, from us, if we were thinking about getting Samson onto a clinical trial, Diana, how would we go about that? What would be the process?
So thank you, Lynnette. I think how you introduce things were, it really set where we stand really in terms of there's so many clinical trials now in Duchenne, but I think families are grateful for the information that's in the public domain, but there's information about the clinical trial process, but there's also, it's about having expectations of what's involved in a clinical trial and what you think what's going to happen at the end of the clinical trial. And so I hope that from our conversations today, it starts the ball rolling. And if any family wants to come talk to ourselves or wants to talk to others in more detail about the clinical trials, don't hesitate to get in touch, because like you said, it's a very complicated area. We really want to break it down so that it's more manageable, also that you're informed and you have all the information in terms of all the options that may be available for your family and for the young people themselves. So I'm sorry, the question was around how to get on clinical trials. So the first port of call is to really have a conversation with your consultant. So I think it's really important to think about your next appointment. And I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because as a parent and as a young person, you're dealing with so many different things. But if you've got that 6-monthly appointment coming up, I think it's really important to either contact us or really think about what questions, because you've got a limited time with them, what questions do you want to ask? Because, you've been exposed to all the press releases in terms of all the clinical trials which the pharmaceutical companies are running and the academic trials, and I'll talk about the difference between them. But it's really important to have a list of questions. I think it gives you the power and the knowledge and the comfort to really go in there thinking, right, these are the options, because I think you can see what's out there in the public domain, and you can see what we post on our website, and you can see everything that's happening. But I think it's about having that conversation with your consultant, because as an individual, you may be eligible, but as a family, you may not be eligible. And eligibility, so the definition is every trial has criteria for you to be included. And that's really important, because if you don't have that baseline criteria, and if it's really open, then there's no comparison for when they look at the data at the end of the clinical trial process, and when they are looking at filing for when they want the drug, the potential drug, to go to the market. So first step is to engage your consultant. A really important step is to, if you haven't already, which I hope you have when you had the unfortunate news about your diagnosis, is to really look at the letter that you get given in terms of the genetic information and the mutation with your diagnosis. And we really hope that at that point you would have contacted ourselves to go on the DMD registry. So the DMD registry is a registry which is the largest one in the UK and contains all the genetic information. And also we get contacted from healthcare professionals and companies about some of the trials they're doing, but also to provide some information for some of the work that they're doing. So I think there is that element to it. So to speak to a consultant, hopefully you would have registered with our registry, but also I think it's really important to have those ongoing conversations with ourselves, because it is gathering at a different pace. So it's important to think that a clinical trial, as soon as it's announced, might already be open, and depending on what type of trial, which we'll go into later, it is, then they need different number of participants in different areas. So engage your consultants, go on the DMD registry, speak to charities like ourselves if you're not getting the information that you want, and try not to feel overwhelmed. It's better to ask questions than to feel like because we don't want families or young people to ever feel like they're missing out. We want it to be fair and transparent. So I think engage as many people in the process as possible, and then we can go into a bit later on in terms of the expectations for the different trials, and that's really important. It's really important that that consultant has a conversation with you and your family about what you can expect in terms of the actual process, but also if that suits you, but also the consenting process, and that's also very important. That's quite a long answer. Do you have any questions around that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I'd say as well, what are the potential problems for a young person going onto the trial, or for the family going onto the trial? Yeah, what problems could arise? I mean, in terms of potential disappointments, stresses, that kind of thing.
It's a really good question, and I think that's something that I'm sure when you're at that point where you know that there may be an option which may be available to you, and you have to make that decision for either yourself or your family, then I'm sure that's a question that comes up in everyone's minds about what are the risks, what are the potential pitfalls. So it's really important to think about a clinical trial as a clinical trial is not access to a treatment. A clinical trial is an investigation. So if you think about a clinical trial, when a new molecule, a new treatment is discovered in the laboratories, and when they do all that snazzy stuff in the lab, and they look at whether there may be benefits, they do some animal work. A clinical trial is basically a first in human. So it's an investigation. So there may be benefits, but it is important to think about, number one, the risks. So one of the risks which may happen, which often doesn't, but it may, is adverse events. So adverse events are events which occur through the course of the trial and may or may not be deemed as a safety concern. And you have different categories of adverse events. And it could be for a number of reasons. It could be just a reaction to the treatment. I also don't want to say that all treatments most don't have adverse events, but there is always a risk in any investigation, and in particularly in clinical trials, which are complex and over a long period of time, there is a small risk. It's really important when you have those conversations with your consultant that during what's called the consenting process, when you give your consent to participate, or perhaps you give your consent on behalf of your family, the risks, so any potential safety concerns are really explained properly to you. That's really important. Okay, another risk. So it's not just about the potential treatment which might come out of the end. It's also about the protocol itself. if you have a busy family life, or if you're a busy individual and you have to travel 3 hours and you have to go, weekly over, 3 hours, and then you have to do that over a period of years, that person has to think about the burden on their time, but also for their families. And that's also something they have to really think about. It's not just about the treatment. It's about, right, what is a protocol in the long term? How can I really juggle this with my busy family life, my working life? So that's something that needs to be considered. But also, I think one of the biggest concerns I think families and young people may have is about the outcome at the end, right? You go into it, I'm sure lots of families and young people go into it with expectations and hopes and aspirations of what might happen at the end. But it is an investigation, and it may provide benefit and it may not. And it's really important to think about it in the context of, if it does work, that's great. If it doesn't work, and this is something which will happen with the healthcare professionals, but also really important to come to different people in terms of support, is, can I also think about, or perhaps can I deal with the fact that it might not have the outcome that I expect? And also it may be interrupted because of different factors, in which case things are interrupted for different reasons. If it's not going well, then it's not ethical for it to continue, because those mechanisms are in place. And also, you don't want to continue on something if it's absolutely clear early on from the data that either there's a safety concern or it's providing no benefit. Then you don't want those families and those young people to carry on participating, especially if big stakeholders like those who monitor safety throughout a clinical trial process have concerns. So I think those are the potential pitfalls, but I think it's important to really think about that, and actually just not only think about it, but ask as many questions as possible when you're thinking about this. It's really, don't rush into anything, take your time. And also for some families and young people, there may be different options which may be presented at the same time. So really think about what your expectations are, but also what's best for you as an individual and your family.
So Diana, as a kind of one of the pitfalls, what about, if hypothetically, Samson or another young person with Duchenne got onto a clinical trial and they fell ill during that time? What would kind of the implications of that be?
I do want the community, young people and families to be reassured about the mechanisms throughout the clinical trial process. So if that does happen, that there is either, it's called a reporting of adverse events. That's the formal way of describing it during clinical trials. So it's really important, as soon as you feel that's, there's a change or there's a reaction to a potential treatment, you must report it instantaneously. And there are mechanisms for clinical trial teams to have that in place with the individuals, and that's done very well. It is important that you do feel if there are any changes that you contact that member of staff immediately, but also that the clinical trial member of staff, whether it's a nurse or a doctor or an investigator, has an obligation and will notify any adverse event to the regulatory authorities and to the company. And there is those mechanisms there. So it's really important that everyone feels reassured by the fact that that's the most important part of the clinical trial process. Okay. And that's done very, very well. If you do see any change, please don't hesitate to contact your clinical staff member who's been helping you or administering the therapy throughout the clinical trial process. Don't be afraid to do that. That's very important. And also, if you think in doing so, you're also helping, others, because if there are lots of safety concerns and they're of a severe nature, then that needs to be looked at by a different stakeholder, and they will assess the trial as a whole, and they will analyze that data. So I want everyone to be reassured that there are those safety mechanisms in place. Just report as soon as you see anything that you feel that is strange or unusual.
So does that also account for if they, if the young person got ill, irrespective of the trial? So if they were ill and they had to miss, they couldn't make it to their appointment, what would happen, then as a consequence?
So again, a very good question. And to link the two, so I think the clinician or the healthcare professional can make a judgment about whether it's likely to be a safety or an concern or an adverse event which is linked to the treatment, although they can't really make that conclusion until a body like the Medicines Health and Regulatory Agency perhaps feels like that's, if it's of a serious nature, there needs to be an investigation. That does happen. If it, which does happen, and that's it can happen, that a family or young person is ill and cannot attend an appointment or misses this part of the schedule, then obviously that needs to be noted by the clinical staff member in the scheduling. It doesn't necessarily mean that individual or that family will be removed from the process. I think the healthcare professional will understand that sometimes that does happen. However, if it is of a nature where it will affect the clinical trial, where it's perhaps something a bit more serious in terms of an acute or emergency admission, then they will have to also review that in line with a clinical trial protocol, and whether they can continue with the investigational therapy in line with a serious admission or acute admission, because the safety of the individual and the health and the well-being of the individual is the most important thing, not the clinical trial process. So if it's of a serious nature where and it's acute and an emergency and won't be resolved in the short term, and then yes, then that's something that will need to be decided by the team as to whether they can proceed with the clinical trial. But the family and the young person would be involved in those decisions every step of the way.
Okay. And if we see, we see a lot of trials going on across the world. So what for families who see clinical trials going on in different countries, are they able to apply? Are some clinical trials exclusive to residents of some countries? We often hear of families floating the idea of moving countries for clinical trials. What would you say to that?
It's such a great question, and and it is also a difficult one because, like you said, we have seen that, and we do know of families and individuals who have decided to take that step because they do feel that it will give their family perhaps a different outcome, and that's also comes down to expectations about clinical trials. What I would say is don't make any rush decisions. I don't think I think it's important to have those discussions with your clinical trial team, so your consultant, your clinician, about the clinical trial process, because it's not done in isolation, clinical trials. So depending on the type of the clinical trial, it could be that it's at an early phase, which looks at safety, and it's done in a small number of individuals. But it could be in 6 months' time that they'll open lots of different sites in different countries. And if that family had waited 6 months, they may have been able to enroll or be screened for and consented for that trial. So don't make any rush decisions. I think it's important to think about, discuss with the clinician, right, I know about this trial, what are the next steps? And, it depends on the type of treatment, it depends on what the plans are. And the clinician, and particularly the consultant level, will be familiar with the plans in terms of what might happen next. But also, I think it's really important to contact groups like ourselves and others, and to be, come to the conference, see what else is happening, see the plans. And that's why it's really important to be informed and not to think about just right now, but think about how things may change in 6 months or 12 months. So don't make any rush decisions. Things can change. There might be you might decide that it could be a trial that you want your family or young person to participate in. It could be that you move and you're not eligible, or it could be that there is another trial which is nearer to you, which may open in 6 months. I think it's important to be well informed about the options which may be available, and then think about not only in the short term how things might pan out in the long term.
Okay. So as a family, I've never had, my husband and I, we've never had any kind of, clinical experience. We've just got a very normal background. And when we had the diagnosis and we were presented by lots of
phase 1, phase 2, phase A and B, and open label, and all the different ways of describing the clinical trials. It is a minefield to try to get your head around it. Perhaps, Dinah, would you be able to explain what those things mean? What are the different kind of stages of a clinical trial?
Of course, yeah, and I can appreciate it is very complex from an outsider's point of view. And at last year's conference, we did a presentation on clinical trials of expectations, but also the different what the process is. And I think that was quite illuminating, actually, for families and young people. So I will summarize the process and then the different definitions and stages. So if you think about the clinical trial process, and as investigation, not access to a treatment. So you have different phases, and that's why it's called phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. So I'll describe what those mean. Phase 1 is really the first in man, in human study. So phase 1, the aim of a phase 1 study is just about safety. You want to ensure that investigational therapy is safe. So usually a phase 1 study is generally less participants, generally is around not only the safety, so whether there is any concerns or adverse events, but also the distribution of the investigational therapy around the body. Does it circulate well? Does it go to where it needs to go? So it's really around the chemistry and how it's absorbed in the body, if there's any safety. So phase 1 is a small part of the clinical trial, but a very important part. And then if you move into the difference between phase 1A and phase 1B, which I can appreciate is used intermittently, but they are different. So if we frame the fact that phase 1 is about safety, a phase 1A is about looking at a single ascending dose. So let me explain that. So you have a dose, right? Every investigational compound which is looked at in a clinical trial they want to see not only that it's safe, but also what is the appropriate dose to give, because that might make the difference between something being effective, but something also having an adverse event, which we don't want. So a phase 1A is when they look at the design of a phase 1A study about looking at a single ascending dose, right? So you would have one dose which goes up in number. So if you were to have 10 milligrams, 20 milligrams, 30 milligrams, right? And multiple ascending doses of phase 1B, right? So a phase 1B is looking at multiple doses. So you might have a cohort, which is a group of individuals at the same phase in the study, but they might be in a different dose. So you might have 10, 20 or 30 in the same cohort. That's called multiple ascending dose. So it's just a different way of designing it so you get a bit more information. And that's why some studies have a phase 1A because they feel like it's appropriate to do a single ascending dose to look at the best dose. Some have a phase 2B because they want to do multiple doses. And it depends on the type of therapy. But it's phase 1, forget about the jargon about phase 1A, phase 1B. Phase 1B is about safety, and it's in small number of participants, so you want to be reassured to progress to the next phase that it's safe. Now, the second phase, phase 2, is around looking at, depending on whether you've got some information about the dose, you want to start to look at efficacy data in phase 2. So phase 2 is when you start to really think about collecting data. So what measures are used in the phase 2 trial that will give you data? So obviously you've got in the phase 1, it's around safety. So you would look at signaling in the body, but phase 2, you would look at some primary and secondary outcome measures. So what does primary and secondary outcome measures mean? It means the outcome measure is a measure in which you pin around the trial. So for example, a lot of the trials looked at the 6-minute walk test. 6-minute walk test was measuring how far an individual or a young person could walk in 6 minutes. And it was, and in some cases still is, a primary outcome measure for Duchenne trials. And in the phase 2, you would set that as your primary outcome measure. So you would expect at the end of the phase 2 to collect some efficacy data. So what was the change in the 6-minute walk test? How many meters there was a difference there? And then the secondary outcome measure is you want to look at other things, perhaps apart from muscle function. You may want to look at how a patient-reported outcome measure, or you might want to look at something else. So it's about collecting efficacy data. How effective is the investigational therapy, and what does the data show? And generally, a phase 2 trial is larger. It's generally over a year or 2 years or even more. And you would want to collect that data of a longer time period to ensure that you've got good data over a long time in terms of looking at your data and doing an analysis from the data. And generally a phase 2 study, depending on how small or large the phase 2 study, generally you would have multiple sites, either in the same country or in different countries, depending on what the commercial sponsor wishes to do. But I have to say that it's not just commercial sponsors, pharmaceutical companies who run studies, there are also academics who run studies. So phase 2 is about efficacy, and it's about collecting data, really good data, because I think you generally would want to have a robust data set at the end of the phase 2 study, because a lot of the community feels like that should be sufficient without going to a phase 3. And the next stage is the confirmatory study. So phase 3 is an even larger study, and you would go for multiple sites in multiple countries. And it's to confirm that the data that you collected in the phase 2 is correct. So you would have the same outcome measures, you would have over a longer period of time frame, and you would want to ensure that there was a confirmation and that the data was going in the same direction. So phase 1 safety, phase 2 is the first looking at efficacy and confirmation of the dose, and then the phase 3 is the confirmatory to confirm everything, safety, dose, but also that it's effective. And generally what happens at the end is that either the academic or the commercial sponsor puts all the data together, and then they submit this to a regulatory authority in the national country. So it sounds quite complicated, but it isn't if you just think about phase 1 as safety, phase 2 is starting to collect efficacy data, phase 3 is a confirmatory. And there are variations in between, but just really think about that in that way, and then anything specific, then you can go to appropriate people like ourselves or your healthcare professionals who've got specific questions.
Wow. What an in-depth, wonderful episode. In fact, I've now got questions to some of those answers, but I'm sure we can leave those for next time. And yeah, if anyone's watching and thinks that one question was particularly pertinent, we'll be splitting into short clips, so do make sure you share them with anyone that you think needs to hear them, or any particular ones that you think are worthwhile. Awesome. So another wonderful episode. If you have any questions, make sure to leave them in the comments, and make sure to check out Action Duchenne, their websites, and well, people can call you up if they have any problems or further questions on what they've heard.
That's what
so yeah, and we'll be hearing much more from Diana and Lynnette in the coming weeks and months.
Thanks for having us, Peter.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you all again soon. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.